Castle life might sound romantic, but not in the Middle Ages. When it was time for castle dwellers back then to hit the hay, it would come down to who slept where in the household's shared bed. Welcome to reality, medieval style.
Knock knock! Just kidding, we don't have doors.
During the early Middle Ages, castles were mostly pretty simple. They sometimes had just one main living space, known as the Great Hall. Great halls hosted feasts, legal proceedings, and plenty of snoring. That's because just about everyone in early or in later centuries' small castles lived much of their lives in the Great Hall, sleeping included. Although there was some organization to the nighttime arrangement, who slept where in that space typically depended on rank, even if they were all sharing one big room. The lord and lady would have retired to a bed at one end, perhaps behind a curtain or wooden screen. Others might have sacked out on the floor, which was covered in rushes and nice-smelling herbs, which were swept out and replaced when they got dirty enough. Eventually, as castles grew in size, the noble family might tromp their way up to a second-floor room just above the Great Hall. There, they would have had more privacy, but all medieval things being unequal, some of these chambers came with peepholes that allowed occupants to look down on the Great Hall and its inhabitants and enjoy spying on the nighttime goings-on. Some castles actually set aside rooms for nobles in different buildings, such as a central tower that could offer extra protection if the castle came under attack. But even if they didn't get a private tower, nobles in later medieval times often had access to a private lair called the solar, located on an upper level. The solar was the most likely room in the castle to contain a richly decorated bed, which was often a pricey piece of furniture at the time and could include curtains for extra warmth, privacy, and of course, showing off a household's hefty textile budget. Even so, few nobles would have expected this space to be totally private. Beds might turn into extra seating for visitors, and the entire room was likely to be used for work and socializing during the day.
Welcome to medieval times. I'll be your serving wench, Melinda.
Kitchens were something of a necessary evil inside medieval castles. Of course, everyone needed to eat, and occasions like banquets with tables loaded down with rich food were ideal opportunities for the lord to strengthen alliances, honor religious occasions, and, once again, show off his wealth. Those imported peppercorns sure weren't cheap after all. But kitchens could also represent a very real and deadly danger to the castle's inhabitants. In an era before electricity, medieval cooks used fire, which was an obvious issue in early wooden castles. Things improved when castle builders turned to stone construction, and improved even more when open hearths became enclosed fireplaces set into the wall. This made it easier to stomach having a kitchen close to the hall, though extra hot ovens were still sometimes constructed separately and placed outside. In some castles, sleeping quarters for the higher class folks were located farther away from the kitchens than those for rank and file. At Goodrich Castle in 13th century England, the nicest spots, including what were likely rooms for the powerful Countess Joan de Valence, were the furthest away from the fiery kitchens. Everyone else had to make do with accommodations ranging from nice rooms not far from the noble digs to temporary structures just outside the walls. While the ladies and lords of a castle might retire to their well-appointed solar for a modicum of privacy, few servants would have gotten the same sort of luxury. When bedtime approached in a medieval castle, they were more likely to find a spot in a shared space, whether that was the great hall of the manor, a communal room somewhere in the attic, or even down in what could have easily been a dark and dank basement. Higher-ranking servants would at least get a mattress, or maybe even one filled with soft, warm feathers. But they were almost certainly expected to share that mattress in order to maximize space, regardless of snoring issues or anyone who had a tendency to flail about while sleeping. There are some accounts that indicate, at least in a few medieval castles, servants may have slept above or very near the kitchens. While some may have worried about snoozing so close to a pretty clear fire hazard, it's easy to imagine that these spots were especially nice during frigid, wet winters, and the residual heat of the place could have staved off the bitter cold well into the night. And at that point, it may have been worth packing into what could have been relatively cramped quarters, regardless of the snoring that might have been going on. If given the choice, you might think you'd prefer to be an upper-level medieval servant, at least compared to the lowly drudges who scrubbed the pots in the kitchen or cleaned out the stomach-churning contents of castle cesspits. And in fact, some high-ranking servants were considered to be nobility, or at least quasi-nobility. But while there certainly were perks both material and social that came with waiting directly on the noble family, it also meant that you were required to work in very close proximity to that lord or lady. That might be great, but many of us have had a boss or two we've described as medieval. Think about working for one of those tyrants before unions or occupational safety laws were even an idea. Things could have gotten unpleasant in very short order. It wasn't just that valets and similar servants had to attend to the lord while he did his business in the castle toilet, at least until that task evolved into a plum royal assignment for the groom of the stool. Yeah, that was a thing. Many were also expected to snooze in close proximity to him. How do we know this? Beds. Some medieval accounts of large households refer to trunkle or trundle beds, small sleeping surfaces that would have been tucked away under a larger bed during the daytime. At night, servants would pull out the bed and sleep there to be close in case their hopefully undemanding master needed anything, even in the middle of the night. In other castles, they might be expected to sleep on a nearby bench. Sounds uncomfortable.
Bring forth the knights!
And let the tournament commence.
Though medieval knights are often thought of as gallivanting through the countryside or charging out to any one of a number of medieval crusades, it was also possible that they were part of a castle's full-time staff. In this more settled position, they would have been tasked with defending the castle. This could mean sticking close and protecting the lord, or more generally roaming the guy's lands as a sign of his power, and the occasionally brutal ability to enforce it. They might also be a part of a larger group of soldiers, which could include young pages as knights in training. When it came time to sleep, knights might go to bed in communal barracks, especially if they were housed in a large castle with space set aside for a defense force. There are few records of this, but some castle financial accounts note that money was set aside to house resident knights in accommodations that were separate from everyone else's. Otherwise, knights might have been forced to make do with any number of different castle accommodations, which could include whatever rooms were available, a hastily constructed structure just outside or inside the castle walls, or the old classic of bedding down for the night in the Great Hall. Some knights and soldiers might even have slept where they were stationed in the castle, which sounds an awful lot like curling up for a nap beneath your work desk. In medieval Europe, many royals were seemingly always on the move. Often the entire court was expected to pick up and move at a moment's notice, probably a serious relief for whoever last hosted the hungry, expensive crowd. English kings traveled less than their continental counterparts, but it was still a feature of court life in medieval Britain. In royal castles, the king would presumably be given the most splendid bedrooms. In the 13th century Tower of London, Edward I had an especially nice sleeping area, which has been recreated in modern times to show off the spendy curtained bedstead, luxe textiles, elaborate wall paintings, and a dedicated fireplace that would have kept the big guy nice and cozy. But the flip side of having a royal castle is all the annoying house guests who frequently took their sweet time leaving. Friends and family of the king could stay in a royal castle at the whim of the king, with a local sheriff and castle constable under orders to look after them. This was an especially attractive option for highborn families whose protector was going to be away for an extended period of time and who wanted a relatively safe place to hang out in the meantime. Even noble prisoners of war could enjoy the relative comforts and safety of a castle bedroom. But like most people with house guests even today, not everyone was sad to see them go. Considering how sleeping accommodations varied according to rank, it's probably no surprise that what you slept on was another variable. During the Middle Ages, beds could be seriously expensive and were often reserved for the upper classes, although middle-class folks could put together a simple but decent enough bedstead. And then there were the mattresses, which could be stuffed with all manner of things, from pricey feather situations to ones stuffed with cheaper and more available materials like straw, bits of discarded textiles, and wool. Among the servants, the quasi-nobles who worked in positions like pages might have a nice enough spot on a feather mattress, though they would have been expected to share their bed with other servants because servants. And the lowest-ranking people on a castle or medieval society at large might not even get the luxury of a prickly straw and hair-stuffed mattress. Instead, they might have to make do with nestling down directly into straw, hopefully a thick enough layer to at least insulate them from the chilly hard ground or floor. Even servants who had mattresses would have had to find a way to stow them during the day, especially if they'd camped out in an otherwise public space like the castle's Great Hall. In the later decades of the Middle Ages, the poshest of the posh women might have scored their own sleeping quarters. Medieval literature occasionally mentions women who control access into and out of private sleeping spaces. For instance, and this is a heck of an instance, the medieval legend of Melusine is about a beautiful woman who forbids her husband from entering her room one day a week. He spies on her and sees her transform into a half-snake creature during her personal time. Long story short, Melusine flies off. Did I mention she turned into a dragon too? Well, she did. Anyway, she flies off in part because her husband has violated her private space. It's hard to imagine her pulling that off in a peasant's cottage, so it follows that only high-ranking women might have gotten their own castle bedchamber. Women might also have slept in semi-private spaces in the castle just before or after childbirth. Of course, anyone who's given birth or had an infant in their lives knows that sleep at this point is a rare commodity. But there was often a bed involved and a recovery period, which may or may not have included an occasional nap as part of the deal. Still, it wouldn't have been strictly private, as medieval childbirth was often attended by a bevy of women, including a midwife, relatives, and servants. At least in upper-class homes like a castle, the room would probably have been cleaned ahead of time and decked out in the nicest textiles.